All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the interview section of our radio show. Today, we're talking about addiction, and we thought who better than our colleague and friend, Dr. Fay Dennis, to come and speak to us. Hi, Fay.
Hi.
Hi. So Fay is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow based at Goldsmiths University in London. And for a long time, Fay has been kind of thinking about and trying to disrupt and deconstruct and disrupt our understanding around substance use and kind of people drug using practices. And so, and I think in Fay's work, she often does encounter addiction, and she has a really unique way of thinking about it. And we thought it would be great to have her as a guest. So thanks for agreeing, and thanks for making some time for us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And also, yeah, feel free to say any more about yourself, because I always feel super awkward about like, oh my God, I'm just talking about someone and they're here, and yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, I'm Fay. I'm a researcher at Goldsmiths. I've kind of been researching and working this field for the last 15 years. And I've got a current research project that's looking at the changes to substance use services following the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's what I'm currently kind of embedded in.
Nice. You're a very exciting guest for me to have on as well. I used your work so much in my PhD. I think you were my biggest cited person. So thank you so much. Your way of thinking about stuff helped me so much. So I'm really excited to chat more today. So let's do it. Our first question is, Julia's already mentioned kind of your work more broadly, but thinking about addiction more specifically, how have you or how do you encounter the idea of addiction in your work?
Yeah, so it's coming through my work with participants who are service users and people who work in services, and it often comes via kind of 12-step programs and like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and it's kind of framed in terms of people like powerlessness and people kind of understanding their dependency through like not having much control over their drug use. But it kind of comes through those sort of programs as opposed to through like what we might see as the science of addiction. And actually people often talk about like Anna Millington was talking about on Twitter the other day, who's a great person to follow. She was saying like who has actually ever seen a addiction psychiatrist. So I think like there's talk of addiction, but it's mainly through these discourses of 12-step programs rather than like the scientific kind of models of addiction, although I think the two also speak to each other. So yeah, but yeah, it's coming through like my research participants.
That's really interesting, because you already mentioned like kind of powerlessness and then kind of agency, and I think these are things that I think that these are sort of really, really strong themes that we come back to when we try to think about understanding addiction, because sometimes addiction is framed as something that makes people completely powerless, and then sometimes it's framed as a kind of choice that therefore kind of grants people agency and kind of individual responsibility over their condition and stuff. So yeah, I guess these are sort of things that keep coming back, particularly depending on what model we might agree with or kind of present. But yeah, so more about your participants then, or people that you've encountered whilst doing research. So how do the people that are involved in your research talk about addiction? So how do they characterize it?
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, I should have said this at the beginning, that I don't actually tend to use the term addiction because it's such a loaded term. So when I talk about addiction, I'm very much talking about it as like a construct and a concept that comes from outside the community. I think it's like something that's not, it does exist, within community of people who use drugs, but it's got this very kind of definite lineage of where it's coming from through 12 steps. So, and there's a lot of people that don't subscribe to that kind of way of thinking, so I tend not to use the language because it's already imposing this like history. Yeah, so I tend to use plainer language like dependency, if that's what I'm talking about, rather than yeah, addiction. So what was your question about addiction?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that it's a fully loaded term, and I think that we're using it here because in part because we're trying to problematize it, you know, but in part also because it's something that people think they understand. You know, people think they understand what it is when you talk about it, but then actually, you know, when you dig deeper, then you know it's you know, it's full of layers and kind of like controversy and debates and so on. And I think, you know, but yeah, so I guess my question is really, you know, when it comes to people involved in your research, how much of their views on addiction or drug dependency do you think is influenced by sort of mainstream understandings or constructions of addiction?
Yeah, I think yeah, so I think that there is that stuff that's coming through, and I think it can cause like confusion for people, because like it sets up these kind of conflicts going on around the mind over the body, because I think addiction is often seen as this kind of disease of the body, and if only we could kind of like battle it with the mind, if only we could kind of like resist our bodily temptations, then we'd be okay. So it kind of sets up these conflicts. I think it can be quite yeah, quite damaging. Although saying that, for some people it really makes sense. I feel like there's always this kind of yeah, these complexities that you talk about, and people have spoken to me about like being like the addict sort of that lives within them and having to be on guard against it, which I think can be kind of like quite it can have some kind of harmful kind of effects. Yeah, but again, some people find it helpful and some people don't, so I just feel like there's always these different ways of viewing it.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually kind of like, because you know, you're already operating on this kind of battlefield of like mind and body or whatever, and then this kind of conflict is automatically arises from that. But as you say, like for some people, conceptualizing it in that way is kind of helpful to feel like they can have some control over their lives, maybe, or something. So it can be like a useful way or a useful tool even to kind of define it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
I wanted to ask to like a little bit follow up on one of the things you said, which I thought was so interesting. Like, so you say that you tend not to use the term in your work unless kind of, you know, because it's such a loaded term, unless kind of critically so. And you talked a little bit about kind of what you use instead, which was dependency, I think. Is that kind of like the main term you use instead, or are there any others, and like, you know, why do you prefer them, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean my work is about trying to research what is meaningful to the people that I carry out research with. So I try to use the terms that they use, and I think that people who use drugs are much more inventive around these relationships than what mainstream kind of society is. So there's a range of terms, but people kind of talk about like habit, for example, and I think habit is more expansive and more capacious as a term than addiction, because it kind of brings in the social and the body and doesn't have quite the same kind of baggage that addiction does. But people talk about their relationships with drugs as like a friend or a girlfriend, and like having mixed feelings. It's much more complicated than the idea of an addiction, like, which kind of puts that complex relationship, it kind of reduces it to neurological kind of matter, which I don't think makes like a lot of sense for everybody. So yeah, so I guess my research is about complicating these definitions through what's meaningful and what makes sense to people who use drugs. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you say about habit. I think that's really, it takes you in a really like interesting direction to think about like how drugs are used. I also like some of the stuff you've written around like triggers and stuff like that as well. And I feel like I'm not saying it good, but as you said, like how it allows for like the body as well, and like the material space and like everything that's going on, to like think about it all at once. Like I found that to be really helpful. I was also interested, you mentioned like as a phrase, like the science of addiction as well. Is and I feel like this kind of links to the next question that we were going to ask, like medical models of addiction. Like is the science of addiction, in your understanding, like kind of similar to a medical model? And like what do you understand when you say like the science of addiction? Like what are you trying to convey, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I guess it's like this kind of brain disease model that's been kind of the main proponents are through the National Institute of Drug Abuse in America, and it's kind of been driving a lot of the research that happens on this subject around the world. So something like 80% of research is kind of driven by this model. So it's been very much bankrolled, you know, like this is something that is where the funding is. And I think yeah. So I'm kind of talking about that neurological kind of model of addiction when I talk about kind of medical addiction. And I think it can be helpful in terms of like what you say about it being different from like a moral kind of understanding of addiction. So it is considering the you know, that people might not have an awful lot of like dependency, people might not have an awful lot of choice and stuff about what they're doing. And then the kind of moral idea is like there is choice. So in that sense, it's kind of you know, can be destigmatizing and produce a more caring approach. But I do think there's other ways of looking at it as well, which comes more through like the harm reduction model and more through drug user activism, which is like around living better with drugs, like trying to, you know, accept that they're part of that they are part of some of people's lives, and like some people just want better ways of trying to manage that rather than this constant need to reduce and live without them, which can put people into these psychological conflicts that we've talked about, but also like cause a lot of harm and, you know, driving people kind of underground and stuff, and not being able to get the support they need because of the stigma that comes with it. Yeah.
That's really interesting that, in a sense, you know, there is so little space. I mean, it's interesting that people who use drugs, particularly people that have dependencies, can think about and talk about their relationship with drugs in a way that, you know, in a way that's different, or, you know, in a way that's other than just, you know, disease or like lack of choice, or indeed a choice that is always harmful, for example.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was thinking about.
And I think that then gives space for more kind of discussions around better substitution medication, because with our efforts always on like, you know, a more kind of abstinence-based recovery kind of approach, I think we forget that there might be better substitution medications like diamorphine, for example, for heroin, which is you know, it's some legal heroin, and maybe people can live an all right life yeah, on something prescribed like heroin, and then the harm is actually coming from outside, from the criminalization, and with that taken away, then yeah, people do talk about being able to live you know, lives where they can look after their loved ones and kind of work and everything else.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that like with substitute medication, we either offer like inferior drugs or drugs that don't make people feel as good, or that are designed to not make people feel good, or we just like we kind of pose the abstinent model as the morally superior one, so that the one that everybody should kind of aspire to, right? And so actually we don't give people a lot of choice in the matter at all. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the moral and medical kind of debate, there's a good and there's probably speaks to your listeners kind of the questions around science of addiction. There's a good podcast at the minute that's been published by The Guardian on the science of addiction, and there they have an interview with Peter Hitchens and Matthew Perry, like from I think from 10 years ago, where this exact debate is kind of played out.
Yeah, I was actually watching a clip of that the other day, and I was like, oh God, like we definitely need to talk about this because it's just too good. I mean, it's not, but it's very like, it just encapsulates it perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel, I mean, Peter Hitchens, it always feels like a bit of a caricature, but yeah.
He does indeed, yeah. Have you ever, yeah, I remember like, I think I went to a debate with him and someone else, and he was just like, couldn't believe the guy, but anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question kind of relates to kind of how people use drugs might define, you know, their relationship with drugs slightly differently than what the addiction kind of paradigm allows for. And it's kind of about thinking about kind of maybe the good experiences that they may have with drugs. So can we think about kind of any pleasure that comes with addiction? And if we don't do that, why not? Why don't we do it?
Yeah. I think we can, but I think that the addiction model as it stands makes it very difficult to incorporate those conversations because like the science of addiction, a lot of it is kind of setting up this dichotomy between wanting and liking. And like liking is seen as like a subjective kind of pleasure, and wanting is seen as this I forget how they phrase it, but like objective, like in the brain, and kind of addiction is defined as this where wanting overtakes from liking. So almost by definition, addiction cannot be pleasurable. So there is this kind of paradox between like pleasure is addictive, but addiction cannot be pleasurable. So yeah, I think that our current model of addiction makes it very difficult to include those conversations. But I think it's really important to have those conversations because it has like a humanizing effect, like considering that people have all these array of experiences with drugs and like the complexities that happen and people use for lots of different reasons, and pleasure can be part of it. It's not all just about loss and stuff and, you know, tragedy and crisis and things. So yeah, I think it is an important one to have, but our current models make it difficult.
It's so weird to me because we often talk about kind of, you know, in terms of, you know, when you were talking about habit, I was thinking about routine and how we really prize routine in terms of having some sort of disciplined way of life where you can make the most out of having like a kind of regime that you get something out of. And I was thinking about this in particular in relation to exercise. So in a way, like the idea that you have a routine with exercise and that you might be addicted to exercise or like addicted to the endorphins that you get from exercise. That's kind of good. That's glorified. So we can use addiction in relation to exercise and allow for like the pleasure to live within that. And yet, you know, we can't do the same with drugs. And yeah.
I think it's just because it's such a kind of political topic, and I think that current governance is very much still based on like drugs are bad. So it is hard to have those more there's more kind of interesting conversations or whatever, like different ways of conceiving of it, because it's so driven by yeah, drugs are bad, people shouldn't use them, people that use them are bad people.
I was, well, while you were talking, Julia, as well, both of you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, about around like habit and routine. And I remember in part of your book, Fay, and this really like sticks in my head, this like story or like, yeah, participants' experience that you talked about. I think you were talking about like the ways in which like drug effects like can be like gendered. And I think it was maybe like you were talking about a woman who would use drugs and then like do cleaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like how, yeah, it's like part of these kinds of everyday like productive, like, you know, we'd look in and see like that's a productive thing to be doing, like maintaining your household. And maybe there was even like pleasure to be found in that, like, you know, like you can get real I'm not sure maybe what drug it was in relation to, like maybe some kind of stimulant drug, if I remember.
I think crack, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting because it's like, okay, we've got this like drug use, which we see as bad, but then it's kind of coming out in this way that we might see as productive. But then of course you've got these like gendered elements as well, like you're saying how interesting it was that only like your women participants like did experience it in that way. So just like so much happening. I don't know if that was a question or just adding to the
yeah, I guess it brings in the social, and that kind of element is you know, understanding dependencies in terms of habit maybe allows for that kind of social element, whereas addiction, it feels like it does feel more prohibitive in what it can include.
Yeah, well, that, I guess, I mean, I feel like we've been touching on this already in like thinking about alternative words we can use, especially those that like come from people who like people themselves who use drugs and what they prefer, what they feel captures their experiences. So yeah, I guess kind of connecting to that, in addition to that, what kinds of conversations do you think would be productive for us to be having about addiction moving forward? Any ideas that you have on that?
Yeah, I think it does have to come from this idea of how we can live with drugs better, like different ways of understanding drug use beyond addiction. I think addiction's really tied up with the criminal model and ideas of drugs being bad. And I think that we need to kind of have some acceptance around that drugs are part of the world that we live in, and how can we ensure that people can live with them better, like, yeah, the harm reduction kind of stuff. And then we can, you know, still shamefully we don't have drug consumption rooms in this country and in the UK, but that should be changing soon in Scotland. But you know, need to make more space for heroin, like diamorphine, as a medication that people can live on well, successfully, live productive lives, you know, and go to the people that we're talking about, like how do they want to live their lives, rather than projecting something that comes from outside and constantly trying to like force on these abstinence-based kind of approaches that although again, you know, that can be helpful for some people, for lots of people it can't, and those voices are often neglected and hidden, and that's when people get pushed underground and can't get the support they need. So I think we just need to make space for different relationships, like different ways of understanding drug use and different relationships with those drugs. Yeah, to have a more caring society. I think at the minute some people who use drugs dependently feel completely uncared for, and they're right in that, and that we have like the most, you know, the highest drug related death rates in Europe, and it's appalling. So yeah, going to the people who use drugs, trying to seek better understandings from them, yeah, for more caring kind of interventions.
I love that you framed it as a question of a matter of care, because I think that, you know, so much of what addiction does as a concept in the way that it's currently defined, or it has been kind of constructed over the decades, is to kind of exclude people.